What's up, everybody? I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our discussion for today, Thursday, December 1st, 2022. As you can see, there is nothing going on in the Atlantic today, as hurricane season ended yesterday. As it says here, there is no tropical cyclones at this time. Hurricane season runs from June 1st to November 30th, and today is December 1st. So since the hurricane season has ended, I decided to come on here and review it with you guys. Interesting season, I definitely have to say. For sure, it was definitely not a typical season that you would expect, especially in a lot of aspects. And of course, in what we thought would happen, a lot of things panned out differently, but they still had some of their moments that still caught us off by surprise, which we'll obviously talk about today. Just taking a look at the map, and you could see clearly why this season was weird. No deep tropical activity, but of course we had all of the activity out here in the western Atlantic once again, obviously with Ian impacting Florida, Fiona being a very strong storm for Canada, and then we also had some other activity including Nicole as well. We'll all go into that in a moment, but first just want to review and take a look at the map. Certainly we had a lot of activity here and here, but not here. And that's what probably made it for an interesting season. And of course, our numbers too, compared to what everybody was saying. We thought that this season would be absolutely off the wall in terms of everything. Certainly did not pan out that way, but it was still quite an interesting season, I must say. The fact that we did have only 14 named storms, 8 hurricanes, and 2 major hurricanes, as Phil Klotzbach mentions here in his tweet that he said from the 2022 Atlantic hurricane season from November 28th, so earlier this week. Um, he posted this, and basically it shows all the forecasts that he's also done before. Notice how he was one of the many people predicting that this season would be an above normal season. We had, of course, 168 points expected in April. Then June and July was 180, real active season. And then come August, he was expecting 150, and we only ended up with 95. So what is that about? Why was that the reason um, that happened? And look here too at all these other forecasts as well from the 2022 season. If we look at the time frame, we see a lot of forecasts calling for very similar amounts: 20, 21, and CSU, and even NOAA from the National Hurricane Center, their forecast 21 named storms as much as, and even in the August outlook, 20 as well. And yet we only ended up with 14 named storms, 8 hurricanes, and 2 major hurricanes. But the part that is the catch is, look at the fatalities we had this season. 337 total. That's because we had multiple quite devastating storms, if I have to be completely honest with you, and the damage got pretty up there. $54 billion in damage, and that is at number 6 on the list, even surpassing 2020, which we all know how that season went. So what was the deal though? Why did we have sure, we were all expecting a hyperactive season, and we were all met with a season that was, in terms of statistical metrics, kind of below that. But why do we still have a devastating season? Well, I guess we could take a look back at some of the storms we had just to hopefully get some sort of answer from that. And notice the first storm, obviously, we started off with Alex, a storm that was expected to form somewhere out here. Did impact Florida, but didn't form till after Florida. Maybe though could have given Florida a warning sign that maybe something was in store for it, since it was the first impact of the season and it was in Florida. And we know what would happen later on of how that would pan out. Then fast forward to September. This is where the part with that gets less active than what people thought. This is Danielle, and this was all the way in September 1st. And this was also the first hurricane of the season, the latest to do so since 2013. some typical random hurricane in the subtropics. Not too much to talk about except the fact that this was a late forming hurricane, but still quite an interesting one. Did kind of a loop and then went down and did something over here, I guess as an extratropical system. But then this is where we really get to the intense part of the season. Fiona kind of formed out of a tropical wave that was not expected to do much. Then it moved along, impacted the islands, and Puerto Rico's pretty potent, nuisance type of category 1. Then once it lifted out, went near the Bahamas, rapidly intensified, became a major hurricane, and before you know it, it was a category 4, passing very close to Bermuda, then on to Canada, where it did impact as an extratropical storm, but still, in fact, the most intense storm on record to hit Canada in terms of barometric pressure. Was roughly when it hit Canada, the pressure was still in the 930s, and that's quite intense if you ask me. So you would see how we start seeing a pattern of intense storms that still happen this season despite the activity. Then we move on to Ian. Not much Ooh, that's a little weird. Not much explanation needed here. Started as a tropical wave in the Caribbean, then went on, became a hurricane, then became a major hurricane, making landfall in the western Gulf Coast of Florida, devastating Fort Myers, that whole entire area. And then we go on to October. We had Julia. This was a nuisance hurricane, made landfall as a strong category 1, and it actually produced 90 deaths. If I look back at the article on Wikipedia, I could show you too. It also produced 90 deaths, so that was a pretty nuisance sort of a storm. Of course, making those impacts as it was making its trajectory, becoming eventually an East Pac crossover, the second out of 2 that would end up happening this year, which was also unusual. And finally, we end on Nicole, which was a very weird November hurricane. I remember this one. We probably all do. Making landfall as the Florida's East Coast's first hurricane landfall since Katrina. Very interesting turn of events, but it ended up making landfall in Florida, caused actually quite a bit of impacts for a category 1, and of course being a late season storm. So I guess we could all draw a conclusion why, even though we did not have a lot of extremely intense storms, we still had a lot of impacts, and I guess you can see why. We had all these storms from Julia to Nicole to Ian to Fiona, and then Alex too included, despite the season only being 14-2. And so why, do you ask? First of all, I guess the most important things to ask is, first of all, why did the season end up not being as active as much as possible, but why did it still end up being very impactful? The first part that'll answer about the impactful part, and at least this is my insight, is just looking at the Western Atlantic, look off the Bahamas, look at the Gulf, especially still into November 30th, well above normal. And this is not just right now. This has been the case basically for the last few years, very consistently. The Gulf has been well above normal. The Western Atlantic has been very well above normal. So even when stuff was not happening in the MDR, they still somehow were able to come back to life and make it somewhere here in the Western Atlantic, and out of surprise because of these, at least to us, now looking back, we could tell it was really not much of a surprise, especially the conditions that we had because of the very warm sea surface temperatures and favorable conditions too allowed for so many storms to just get going in the Western Atlantic right before, 2 or 3 days before they made landfall, either in Central America or in the Gulf Coast, especially because of how west they were. Just come in, rapidly intensify, make landfall as a pretty intense hurricane, or at least a hurricane on the Gulf Coast, and that includes Ian this year. And then we also had, of course, some storms in the Bahamas that rapidly intensified as well. Fiona this year as well. That's where the Bahamas comes into play. But just overall, this is my answer to why I think we still had so much impacts, is because the continuously warm Gulf from the past few years has just persisted into this year, and of course the Caribbean too, which is still warm, allow for any impulsive energy that we had to come by and basically take advantage of conditions that were there and rapidly intensify and become quite a potent storm upon landfall. And that was the pattern that we've had not only this year, not only last year, but for the past few years as well. We had Ian this year, Fiona, which impacted Canada last year. The same situation with Ida that made landfall somewhere down here. 2020, we all know how that went. Many storms that got going here with the same situation as Fiona and Ian, all the storms that went over. Delta, you remember that in October, and Zeta as well. And especially the most notorious storm of 2020, there was Laura, which was somewhere right in here. I think actually closer to here. And before that, and look, we can go even before that. If you remember, Dorian was right here. Looked like it would kind of not be as strong once it was over here, but once it got to here, the waters were real warm, and it was able to rapidly intensify like crazy to the very notable storm that we know as it is today, and even back to 2018 and even 2017, where we had Michael over here and Harvey somewhere in here, which obviously caused the tremendous damage that we all know it had today. And this was all because of the same pattern of the Gulf being so warm and stuff being able to get into these conditions and thriving under them, especially with the very little time we had. And you could also see how it's been caused, that why we had so many storms that were, did not form out here, is because especially what's been happening this year in the last few years too is look at how warm the Atlantic is as a whole, especially in the mid latitudes. And this has been an outstanding issue, if I guess that's the best way to say it, from causing hyperactivity in the MDR and causing a lot of long track storms that we typically know very active hurricane seasons to produce. We do not have that. We do not have that this year, and this is especially an issue because look at how overwhelming the subtropics warmth is in the mid latitudes and the subtropics compared to the deep tropics. Everything has been skewed, and so that's why we're not able to get much going here. But since the waters were warm here, and conditions would then be more promising for development, we would get stuff going down right here. So that's why I think the main general idea that we had this season, with a lot of storms not being able to get going here, but then once they got here, they really were able to blow up and become real intense storms. And this is not only this year, this has been the last few years of this too. And some people might blame on what we have over here, which is the Pacific. And you notice how we have all these blue anomalies. This is of course associated with the La Nina, which persisted for a third year this year. A lot of people tend to say that the La Nina caused so much of the energy focused in the deep tropics to, on a global scale, to be moved to the subtropics and focus the energy there, which is why we're seeing stuff like we do here in the Atlantic, where we have all this energy here. And you can also take a look at how that is in the East Pacific as well. We had all this energy here, but not down here, and that really skewed everything and caused a lot of stuff to be thrown off, especially with how persistent we've been in the La Nina. So that's the answer that might prove why this year might have not been as active, but still, of how warm the Western Atlantic was, we still had as much activity as we had and as much impact as we had. And going forward, these are going to be some very interesting things to watch, especially with the Western Atlantic, especially knowing from the past few years. We need to watch the Western Atlantic to see just how warm does it remain throughout the winter months, and just how does it persist into next year. Because if anything, if we do have more activity once again in the Western Atlantic, we'll have to see, because if this persists, we will definitely have a lot of fuel and definitely a lot of energy to produce for more devastating, damaging storms. And the cycle that we keep on having every single year will just continue to persist for the West Atlantic, and that especially goes for to see how the La Nina persists, because again, that's what's been skewing everything. So if we see the same of that we keep on seeing stuff to skew activity and to affect it and concentrate it in certain areas like we have seen in the West Atlantic, these are some very key features to monitor going through the winter and obviously into the spring. And that's what we will be doing here on this channel. Obviously going into the winter months, we will obviously not be talking often, but when we do, we will be focusing on this area very closely, and this area too, because those are the two most important factors that I've taken out of, especially over the last few years, that have really impacted us the most when it comes to hurricane season, not only in impacts, but starting to the point where it's starting to impact the total numbers too, throughout the season. So definitely interesting stuff to watch. And of course, the ENSOs we did talk about. Some stuff, some of the many things that we need to watch throughout the season, and we need to see what exactly happens. You take a look at the ENSO model predictions from this past November. This November, you can take a look at basically what all the models show, and they do generally show a very similar idea, that is an general increase from the La Nina that we have that's currently ongoing. They kind of show that dissipating and kind of phasing into a warmer event in the ENSO region. This model, which is the JAS, not the JAS, this is, what is that? The dynamic average, I think. That's what I think it is. Takes it up to a weak El Nino threshold. This model up here takes it up to a very strong El Nino, and that will be very interesting to see if that happens, although I do doubt it. But the general model consensus is that we will move away from a El Nino, or La Nina, I mean, which is what we're in right now, given all these cool waters out here, and given also what the model is showing here. All of them are moving away from La Nina as we go in towards the months, so that will be something we need to watch into next season, because especially when next year is a neutral, sometimes those years can get interesting too when it comes to the impacts, because when in neutral, it's not really skewing stuff in one specific direction. It's kind of just neutral. So therefore, especially in those type of years, in a neutral, it also is statistically proven that the Atlantic does indeed tend to really thrive most in those years and produce seasons that are hectic and obviously not very pleasant for us. So we need to watch this very closely going into the winter months. The SOI too, which is very in direct correlation with the ENSO. This is something we need to watch too. SOI has been taking as in recent weeks. That is in part due to the ENSO weakening as well. That'll be something we need to watch in the next coming months too, and we'll obviously be monitoring that. But that's not the only things that we will be going over. We will also, if you want to look for in-depth forecasts and in-depth discussions on the season, you could look towards some of these dates that we have planned out. The 2023 qualitative discussion, our first discussion on the 2023 season. I do have that planned out for the next, I don't know if it's next week or the week after that, but it will be a Wednesday on December 14th. The first quantitative forecast, so basically the forecasts that we actually give out numbers, because a qualitative forecast is not really giving out numbers, but more or less giving out scenarios of what could happen, what to look for, which I just pointed out right now. And that will be coming in a few weeks from now. The first quantitative forecast, as I said though, which will involve actual numbers. So for me, it's for me giving some sort of name storm, hurricane, major hurricane forecast number like everybody does every single year. That's coming in mid-April, around April 19th of next year. I think that's Wednesday. I don't know when I plan that date, but I'm pretty sure that's Wednesday. And then of course our day one live official seasonal forecast. This is when we will put out the official forecast of the season, and we will also have our annual, as I like to do it, day one live seasonal forecast. Our day one live, basically to ring in the hurricane season and of course, kind of, I guess, celebrate and, have fun and talk about what we expect for the hurricane season. That'll be on the first day of hurricane season, June 1st, 2023. And then our final seasonal forecast, which will be towards the beginning of August, the first month of the peak season, first out of 3, August, September, and October. That'll be August 1st, 2023. And finally, something that we'll have a lot more often than these dates are off-season Hurricane Hub discussions, which is what we brand ourselves, Hurricane Hub, starting this Saturday, December 3rd, and going on every Saturday till May 15th. And then from May 15th onward, which is, by the way, May 15th is the start of the Eastern Pacific season. From that point onward, we start doing discussions much more often, and we also drop the off-season part too, as we are getting closer to the hurricane season. And one of the hurricane seasons that we track in the Eastern Pacific starts on May 15th. That starts moving towards every single day, and then we'll be talking a lot more often. Then we'll be looking a lot more on a daily and a weekly basis instead of a monthly and long range basis. That all starts May 15th, right around very close to the hurricane season, roughly, I guess, 6.5 or so months from now is when the action really starts. But until then, we'll be watching all these things every Saturday as we do, including, finally, what I do want to start including a little more is just regular weather across the United States. That includes, of course, weather that's going on, severe weather, which we can take a look at right now, see if there's anything happening. Not much. We just have this current day 2 outlook, which does have some thunderstorms forecast for the lower 48, and day 3 as well. And then from after that, the potential becomes too low to really forecast anything. And we'll be doing more of this stuff. We'll be looking at that every Saturday, of course, to see what's going on in our neck of the woods, at least for most of us. I know some people might be watching from the Caribbean islands or Central America too. Of course, from time to time, we'll be doing stuff like that as well, looking at your guys' weather from time to time as well. Gonna try to include everybody. Cannot forget about everybody instead of just one group. So we'll try to do as many people as we can and try to be as inclusive as we can with our forecasts. But that is all for the future, and that's all what we plan to go forward from now. So with that being said, I'm going to get off for the evening. I hope everybody enjoyed this discussion, and let me know what you think. Let me know maybe if you have an idea of what you think next year will be like, even though it's a little too early out. Tell me. Of course, subscribe, like the video, get the word out about this channel, so we can not only just me doing this talk to you guys that are out there already, that are already subscribed to me, which is a pretty decent amount of you. We could reach more people. This is what I also want to do, is to reach as many people as I can, talk to as many people as I can, and let them know about the weather, which is why I'm doing this in the first place, is to let people know about the weather, share my knowledge of the weather, but also inform people, and of course inform as many people as possible, which is why I would really appreciate it if you go out and subscribe and like and share with everybody, all your friends and family and relatives. Get the word out that we're doing this, and hopefully we could start a good community from between now and the 6.5 months that we have till hurricane season. Alright, thanks for watching, everybody. Have a good night, and we'll see you very soon.